Evening and welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. With you today, as usual, and for those who don't know me, Irina Zuckerman. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Today, joining us is Marshall Billingslea, who is currently senior fellow at Hudson Institute. Um, he's a former presidential envoy and assistant secretary of the Treasury for Terrorist Financing, NATO IG, NATO Deputy Undersecretary, and today's topic is directly related to his expertise, which is to say, the recent revelations in Wall Street Journal about Iran's uncovered money laundering network, which has effectively allowed it to circumvent sanctions and gather ill-begotten wealth that went to all sorts of dreadful causes. Could you please tell us a little bit more about this situation? How did it come to pass, and how did it come to be discovered now as opposed to in the years past?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you, Irina, on your program. You and I have talked about this, doing a show together for a while, and I'm glad we could make this happen tonight. And you referenced the recent story by Ian Talley in the Wall Street Journal. Ian is a fantastic investigative journalist, and is usually highly accurate with what he reports. And in this case, I think he has shined a spotlight on a number of things that the Iranians have been doing over the past many years to circumvent sanctions and to continue to bring hard currency into Iran. But I must tell you, Irina, we knew that they were doing this in the Trump administration, and we worked actively to combat it, to fight it at every turn, which is why we imposed sanctions on more than 960 specific individuals. And we can talk more about the way that the Iranians are attempting to avoid sanctions, but the real difference and the real reason why this matters now is that the Biden administration has stopped enforcing the sanctions on Iran, has allowed the Iranians to freely begin exporting oil to China and others. And as a result, the Iranian war coffers for their support to terrorists, for their attempts to acquire ballistic missile technology, and for their nuclear infrastructure, those reserves have begun to accumulate once again. So we are entering a very dangerous moment here because the Biden administration hasn't been enforcing the sanctions even before they've arrived at a so-called new JCPOA deal.
Now, can it be safely assumed that the reason why the Biden administration was not enforcing those sanctions was as a way to show some sort of a goodwill gesture to the Iran regime in light of the negotiations, or was there some other reason for this?
Well, I think that probably is part of it. But when we look at the fact that they also haven't been enforcing sanctions on Maduro and the kleptocratic regime in Venezuela, I actually think it's a deeper problem that we have. It's a lack of will and it's a lack of strength. The Biden administration continues to project weakness and feebleness around the world, and they certainly are doing that with respect to sanctions enforcement almost across the board. Also, when you look at the sanctions that they have imposed so far on Russia, these are half measures. They're nowhere near as strong as they should be or as strong as they could be. And again, I think it comes down to a lack of strength.
What exactly is the reason for that, though? Is there some sort of an ideological opposition to sanctions, even highly specific to particular individuals? Is there some sort of a grand strategy for trying to bring all these countries back to the table through non-enforcement and appeals to the better angels? What motivates this outlook? I could understand at least weakness in the face of military action. I wouldn't agree with it, but at the very least, it would be the excuse of trying to avoid violence. But sanctions, what's the problem with them?
It's difficult to say. The Treasury Department issued a sanction strategy last fall, and when you read it, it actually makes a lot of sense, and it echoed all of the same principles that we adopted and used in the Trump administration, the same principles that the Obama administration had and the Bush administration before it. So the issue is not what they've put on paper. The issue is a seeming lack of willingness to take tough decisions, to stand up to these autocratic regimes, to hold them to account, and to impose serious consequences on them. And now the Biden administration, facing disastrous energy policies here at home, is looking at massive increases in gas prices, runaway inflation, looming midterm elections where they are expected to suffer significant losses and ultimately probably lose the House of Representatives and maybe the Senate. And they're desperate for any kind of foreign policy deal. And that's where Iran comes in. And the Iranians know it. The Iranians can sense the desperation, they sense the weakness, and they have played the Biden administration left and right. Even more concerning is the fact that the Biden administration subcontracted negotiations with Iran to Russia and continued to let the Russians meet face to face with the Iranians on our behalf, believe this or not, on our behalf, even while Russia was busy conducting war against Ukraine. You can't make this stuff up. It's truly outstanding, truly just amazing.
This is not the first time the administration has outsourced its foreign policy effectively to another country. We have seen that after the conclusion of the Afghanistan fiasco, US has delegated its diplomatic function to Qatar, which has kind of brought the US into this mess to begin with. And we've seen some other examples of that. What is this obsession by the administration to involve third parties to deal with foreign policy priorities for the US? Is it also a desire to focus on domestic issues? Is it acceding trust to untrustworthy parties? Is it some sort of a multilateral framework that the Biden administration believes in, despite evidence that not all multilateral arrangements works? What's behind this bizarre delegation of duties to other countries?
It's really inexplicable. I believe you're dealing with a number of people who don't understand how to negotiate effectively. These are the old getting to yes crowd when dealing with regimes that are not the least bit interested in getting to yes. They view negotiations as a zero-sum game, but you have US negotiators who don't understand how to use leverage or even how to identify leverage. And don't take my word for it. Just take, for example, the fact that a few weeks or even a week within the job, Joe Biden extended the New START nuclear treaty with the Russians without extracting any concessions whatsoever for a further 5 years. In the Trump administration, we had extracted multiple concessions that the Russians were ready to give in exchange for a 1-year extension of that treaty, and Joe Biden threw it all away. So they've started from a position of weakness and they've continued forward seemingly unself-aware from crisis to crisis to crisis, the latest now being the Iran deal.
Now, Joe Biden is somebody who is not a new politician, to put it mildly. He's been in politics for 50 years, a significant portion of which was in foreign policy, actually, including his years as vice president under Obama. Did he not, in this entire time of his experience, learn that other countries view non-enforcement of one's commitments as a weakness, whether as a friend or as an enemy?
Look, Irina, I served on the majority staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee under Chairman Jesse Helms when Joe Biden was the #2 Democrat and then the #1 ranking Democrat on that committee. I think Bob Gates, the former Secretary of Defense, said it well when he said that on every major foreign policy issue, Joe Biden has got it wrong. I never saw a deal in the Senate that Biden didn't like, and I never saw a deal that he was all that interested in seeing enforced. So his behavior and the behavior of those around him in this administration is not surprising to me.
Alas, unfortunately, many of US allies have interpreted Joe Biden's very specific approach to all these things that, for those who followed his work closely, is identifiably his approach in all circumstances, even prior to his presidency and have projected all of it on the United States in general and all the other Democrats and Republicans from all tribes. And unfortunately, that image is not going to be easy to undo. But that brings us back to Iran's ability to maneuver this polarized situation and this broken image of the United States in light of decisions made by a specific group of people. You mentioned that the mechanisms of money laundering that we described in this article are not new. Various portions of them have been used by Iran through the years, some of them going back as far as the Obama administration, if not earlier. Could you tell us a little bit about that? What were those methods, and before we start discussing the current framework?
Well, Irina, one of the things that we did on my watch, I was not just the Assistant Secretary at the Treasury, but I was also president of the Financial Action Task Force, which is the global anti-money laundering watchdog organization based out of Paris. And as president, my top priority was to see Iran placed back on the FATF blacklist and to see the call for countermeasures reimposed on them because they are a jurisdiction of money laundering concern. It has nothing to do with the nuclear weapons program that they continue to aspire to pursue, and everything to do with the fact that Iran is a jurisdiction where money laundering and corruption is rampant, and it is a highly risky jurisdiction to do any kind of business with. This is why when we came in as the Trump administration, even though all of those sanctions had been taken off, even though the Obama administration had let Iran come halfway off the blacklist at FATF, most European companies, in fact, most companies around the world, India, China, you name it, were still not investing heavily into the Iranian economy because they understood the corruption risks. So when we now talk about how Iran organizes with its central bank a series of shell companies around the world to conduct illegal transactions, we're simply talking about an extension of that money laundering mindset that has been present in Iran for decades. We can get into the specifics, but when you look back at many of the sanctions that we imposed during the Trump administration, they were specifically designed to identify, isolate, and ultimately disrupt these various shell company and secretive transfer mechanisms that they were using in countries like Turkey, Singapore, especially the UAE, but also Iraq, and so on.
Now, what does it take to actually enforce these disruptive mechanisms for identifying shell companies? Some people believe that it's kind of like playing whack-a-mole. You end up chasing these companies that rename themselves and rebuild themselves, and at the end of the day, yes, you can make it harder for somebody, for one particular company to conduct its business, but not impossible. And while you're chasing some of them, others are popping up and conducting their business elsewhere. What kind of resources does it take to pursue it with any level of success?
It does take resources, and you're right. In some respects, fighting money laundering of any type, especially the terrorist financing type of money laundering, doesn't, on some days does look a lot like whack-a-mole. But the purpose and the objective here is to raise the costs to the bad actors. And you can do that, and we did do that through, again, going after these organizations. In many cases, you never saw a sanction imposed because we were able to quietly take care of the issue. If you look at the number of trips I needed to take to the Gulf, to Qatar, as you said, but also to the UAE, to Oman, less of an issue with Saudi Arabia, but certainly in those other countries, a lot of time working with their governments and giving them the choice of taking a law enforcement action of their own or having the United States step in and do it for them. Predictably, these countries typically like to handle these issues quietly on their own, and that's good, and that's a good outcome. And of course, every time you disrupt one of these networks, and you sometimes see criminal prosecutions. Under the Trump administration, we actually seized multiple Iranian related vessels full of crude oil who were circumventing our sanctions. The Department of Justice did, together with friendly countries, and then sold those vessels and their contents off. They auctioned them off. These all bring costs with it to the Iranians. And again, that was the goal that we had, was to impose significant costs on the Iranian economy. And the numbers speak for themselves. Within the short 2 years that the Trump administration was imposing sanctions on Iran, the Iranian currency, the rial, lost half of its value. Inflation skyrocketed to more than 40%. Iranian exports of crude oil, even with all these elaborate shell company mechanisms in place, Iranian exports of crude oil to China dropped to less than 200,000 barrels a day. And they had to go through these very elaborate pricing mechanisms, offering these big discounts to the Chinese, going through these crazy ship-to-ship transfers of oil out in the middle of the ocean to try to evade detection. That all had costs on the Iranian economy. And we saw, as a result, a significant reduction in the Iranian Quds Force's ability to supply the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Shia militias in Iraq, insurgents in Bahrain, a big reduction in their ability to bankroll terrorists around the world. Unfortunately, I mentioned that we dropped those oil exports to China to less than 200,000 barrels a day. Those oil exports under Joe Biden are now 4 times the size they were under Donald Trump. 800,000 barrels a day.
That's quite amazing. And I mean, it's natural that Iran was looking for nearby Middle Eastern countries to do its business with, but I'd also like to ask you about the fact that France and Germany at one point discussed creating mechanisms for circumventing the Trump sanctions. What were those mechanisms? Did they ever get off the ground? And if so, what role did they play in this money laundering scheme?
They never got off the ground, really. They definitely had the ambition of trying to create a barter mechanism with the Iranians to try to get around the Trump administration sanctions. But we knew exactly what they were up to. They were fairly candid with us about what they intended to do and how they intended to do it. And we were fairly candid with them. Remember, we're NATO allies. We were pretty candid with them about how that wasn't going to work, and that any French national, German national, British national that participated in this scheme, and any company that participated in this scheme was running a high risk of being cut off from the US financial system. So unsurprisingly, a lot of people declined to participate in that scheme. But there were some valid reasons to allow certain kinds of transactions with Iran to proceed, which is why we in the Trump Treasury Department worked very closely with the Swiss, with Switzerland, to establish a humanitarian channel for transactions. And it was that humanitarian channel that the Swiss created that wound up being the mechanism that everybody wanted to use. And it had very impressive anti-money laundering safeguards in place. So I wouldn't say, that what the French and the Germans tried to do was effective, but I also wouldn't say that the Iranians were using that as the main way of trying to get around the pressure we were putting on them.
So it looks like China has played a significant role in their money laundering efforts, and China benefited greatly from that, perhaps even more so than Iran itself.
That's true.
And I know that the Trump administration also started going after China for some of this, but now we are not hearing much of whether the administration is pursuing China with relation to Iran-related sanctions circumvention. If it's not pursuing Iran itself, presumably it's also not going after China.
No, that's absolutely correct. The Chinese have gone from clandestinely buying Iranian oil to overtly buying it. They're not afraid of the Biden administration. They're not afraid of secondary sanctions from the Biden administration. And as I've said, they've quadrupled their purchasing from the Iranians. Also, Irina, just recognize that Iran is benefiting from a major windfall in profits because of what Russia has done by attacking Ukraine. The price of oil has spiked. I was just looking before the show tonight, and WTI, one of the benchmark crudes, is selling, I believe, at $114 a barrel, when the Iranian budget was anticipating selling around $40 a barrel. Now, the Iranian crude is more sulfuric than West Texas, but so it doesn't sell at that level. But the Iranians have made a lot of money because of the non-enforcement, and they stand to reap literally 90 to 140 billion, depending on whose estimates you want to believe, in sanctions relief from Joe Biden.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but the administration has gone to great lengths to try to persuade Saudi Arabia to increase production, to cut the gas prices, to no avail. Meanwhile, the Houthis are continuing to wage economic warfare to the benefit of Iran by attacking Saudi oil facilities, which endangers US interests by potentially raising the price of oil even further. Wouldn't it not be in US interest to relegate Houthis to a sanctionable list of foreign terrorist organizations in order for US to defend its own economic interests in the matter, given the current crisis?
Absolutely. One of the first actions the Biden administration took was the reprehensible decision to take the Houthis off the sanctions list as a foreign terrorist organization, the so-called FTO designation that the Department of State applies to terror groups. The Houthis are clearly a terrorist organization. The Houthis are launching, as you said, armed drones and ballistic missiles, not just at Aramco facilities in Saudi Arabia, but they launched them at Abu Dhabi. They've launched them against Riyadh, trying to kill civilians. They've launched them at the airport at Riyadh, and so on. They have strewn sea mines all around Yemeni waters in an effort to sink legitimate commercial tankers. This is a terrorist group, and they are directly supported by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, who funnels them both money and weaponry to conduct these attacks. Both the UAE and the Saudi government have asked the Biden administration to reimpose that FTO designation on the Houthis, and so far, the Biden administration has refused to do so. So it's not very surprising, Irina, that that we're in a situation where the relationship with the Gulf monarchies is very badly damaged at this stage by Biden and what they've done.
But does the administration not owe a duty to its own constituents in terms of the energy crisis? And leaving aside our alliances, the fact that we are suffering as a result of this economic warfare and higher prices, should that not be a factor in the decision-making process?
Yes, but look, we were energy independent under President Trump. I personally don't favor being dependent on Saudi oil any more than I favor being dependent on any foreign country's oil production. What the Biden administration has done here domestically to stifle production is part of why we have the highest inflation rates in 40 years. This is worse than even Jimmy Carter and his handling of the economy. But back to the issue of our relationship with the Gulf states, we should have a very clear shared appreciation for the threats that face us all in the region. And all of those threats emanate from Iran, if not directly from Iran, then indirectly from Iran with the way that they fund terror groups. We should have a unified approach to this, but the fact that the president of the United States cannot get the crown prince of Saudi Arabia or the Crown Prince of the Emirates to return his phone call is a deeply troubling reflection of how badly damaged and how poorly they've handled this relationship.
Well,
And
it
frankly, I
doesn't.
think a lot of this arena is coming down to a very clear view, not just on the part of the GCC nations, but also the Israelis and others, that this new Iran deal is a bad deal. It's a bad deal for the region, and it's a bad deal for our relationship with friendly nations.
Given everything that has transpired, and given these recent revelations about this proliferation of money laundering paradises and safe harbors, do you think that the Treasury and the Biden will take any action to enforce them in light of this publicized uh, deal?
Not not unless the deal, not unless the deal with Iran falls apart, which I don't think it will fall apart because the Biden crowd is so desperate for a deal. They've pretty much given away everything they can give away. I mean, they're even now talking about delisting. We talked about the FTO designation with the Houthis. They plan on removing the IRGC from the FTO list. That's how far they've fallen on these issues. But if the deal does not come through for whatever reason, then at least for the moment, the sanctions are still there and they could be aggressively enforced if we had an administration with the strength to do so.
And you don't believe that if the deal falls apart, Biden would not use these existing sanctions as leverage to try to get the Iranians back to the table?
I would hope that he would, but I would place greater faith in Congress, a bipartisan Congress, with Republicans and Democrats together forcing his hand. I would really probably expect to see, under those kinds of circumstances, mandatory sanctions imposed with which the executive branch, the presidency, is given no discretion, and done hopefully by veto-proof margins to really force the Biden crowd to do the right thing. When you look at where leading Democrat senators, for instance, Senator Menendez, who's chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee for the time being, if you look at what they've been saying, they clearly are unhappy with the Biden administration's performance on these issues. They don't really say as much publicly, but it's pretty obvious.
No, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I've had discussions with the people like Gabriel Narona, who've spoken about Congress and Biden's attempts to circumvent Congress on the Iran deal, on all these sanctions.
Right.
And
Right.
Biden really does not have much time left to do that until Congress flips in November, at which point whoever is there will likely be much more aggressive about pushing back on the executive overreach, arguably, in pursuit of this deal. What exactly is Biden counting on, given the fact that this deal is clearly being rushed, and yet Iranians feel they have all the time in the world because they win either way? They don't really have to sign on to anything because a lot of the sanctions have already been lifted, and they may be lifted, and it'll be difficult to reimpose them the next day if Iran fails to live up to its part of agreement to negotiate. So what exactly is Biden counting on here? What is he hoping to achieve? I'm asking the same question, and still I have not heard a satisfactory answer. I understand why Iran is in for it. They can get a windfall for a few years, even if the Republicans start blocking it the moment they take office. They can still get something out of it. But what is the US and what is Biden getting out of this arrangement?
Well, he has stumbled from foreign policy disaster to foreign policy disaster, and he's looking for anything that they can point to as a win. And so they will attempt to do two things if they do reach agreement. One is that they will attempt to portray the New Deal as something that has once again closed off Iran's pathways to achieving a nuclear weapon. The other argument that they will attempt to make is that this is good for the global economy because now we can see Iranian oil back on the market freely traded. I guess they would rather us buy oil from the Ayatollah than buy oil from fracking in the United States. But there's no way they're going to submit this agreement to Congress, even though there's actually a law on the books that requires it to be submitted. And in fact, you can make an argument that this actually should be taken and treated as a treaty, which would mean that you would need to get 67 votes in the United States Senate for it. And they don't have a majority in the Senate, let alone 67 votes. So there is no way that they're going to let this thing be subject to congressional review and approval.
Would you say that an illegal action of that sort is an impeachable offense?
No, Irina, I'm not going to go that far. The executive branch has a lot of latitude to negotiate agreements. The difference in this case is, as I mentioned, there is a law on the books that would seem to require this to be submitted. Mm-hmm. I tend to, having served in both, as I mentioned, on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but also most of my professional career in the executive branch, I tend to believe that the executive branch should be given deference and latitude in the conduct of the nation's foreign policy. But I do believe in this case that Congress needs to begin enacting statutes that force the Biden administration to do the right thing, because I don't see them willing to do the right thing with respect to Russia, with respect to Iran, or with respect to Venezuela, for all that matter.
Now, speaking of all these countries and others, clearly, in the event of the Iran deal and continuing non-enforcement of money laundering, all of them stand to benefit financially. But where do you see this financial move going in terms of geopolitical developments with Venezuela, with China, with Russia, even with Qatar, or even non-state actors, for that matter?
Well, one of the things that the Russians are very clever, and I know Mikhail Ulyanov personally. I've dealt with him before when I was leading the arms control negotiations in Vienna for President Trump, dealing with the Russians. And he is a very skillful diplomat and a very skillful negotiator. And when the Biden administration turned over responsibility for leading these negotiations on its behalf to the Russians, he took them to the cleaners. One of the things Russia has ensured is that in this new nuclear deal, that they're going to be allowed to follow through with the sale of $10 billion worth or $10 billion worth or more of nuclear reactor technology to Iran for its Bushehr nuclear reactor plants. That's just one example of how the Russians have created a sanctions evasion loophole for themselves in this new Iran deal. So, it really, at least with the Obama administration, when they gave away our national security for the sake of a deal with Iran, they at least had the guts to negotiate face to face with the Iranians. The Biden administration is giving things up, not even sitting across the table from the Iranians, but using the Russians to do it for us.
Which, of course, raises all sorts of questions about collusion. Ironically, there's more of a case to be made here, given the clear political disadvantage which places US, and there's no need for conspiracy theories. There's a clear deal that has been struck for this to happen. Russians would not be negotiating on US behalf without getting something out of it, which, as you say, they did. So that's clearly a foreign policy decision, but it is collusion with the foreign adversarial power that has attacked US through cyber attacks, which has meddled in US elections, and which has done all sorts of other things that are highly objectionable and illegal. So that leads me to the following. you've mentioned previously that you've had to go to various Gulf states and deal with the financial issues there. Since then, would you say since Biden assumed office, would it be safe to say that those countries have returned to their previous mode and don't feel the need to enforce those frameworks? Would you say that that money laundering has returned to Oman, UAE, Qatar, and so forth?
A little bit, but I would say, for instance, with regard to Saudi Arabia, they were excellent partners. I worked very, very closely with them and with General Khwarini in establishing the Terrorist Financing Targeting Center in Riyadh. We shared a great deal of sensitive information back and forth, and they were an outstanding partner. Frankly, all of the Gulf states we worked well with, but obviously they have their own economic interests and they chart their own path. I think in the case of the UAE, in fact, I mentioned it being president of the Financial Action Task Force. One of the things I'm proudest of is actually having been the president of the FATF when we admitted Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel as full members of that anti-money laundering watch group. The UAE has some challenges, and they've been placed on or are headed towards the FATF gray list, but they know what the issues are. It does kind of break down in terms of the different legal jurisdictions you have in the Emirates between the different Emirates, and some of those gaps and seams are exploited. And you're also, dealing sometimes with a conscious decision to engage in trade with Iran, particularly when it comes to condensates, even though the United States really wishes that they wouldn't. They sometimes just make the decision to do it. But when you have an administration that's not willing to go in and have a very blunt conversation with the leadership in Abu Dhabi, you tell me what they're going to do.
Right. Now, that brings me to a question about the anti-money laundering task force. Now that the Biden administration, the United States effectively is no longer really enforcing all these sanctions, what is the role of the task force, and is there any political will with the remaining members to do the right thing? Are
Well,
they
I think
able to coordinate without the U.S. leadership? Is basically my question.
no. I think there is. I think there certainly is, and that will exist in several respects. First of all, the money laundering issues that we have to combat as a global financial system go far beyond the Iranians or the Russians or the Venezuelans. We're dealing here with drug traffickers. We're dealing with terrorist networks, including now, unfortunately, once again, ISIS and Al Qaeda, who are coming back in force because of what happened in Afghanistan. But we have ISIS cells all over Africa. I mentioned Hezbollah and the fact that they have now moved into Latin America, particularly Venezuela, in a major way. So the need to combat money laundering by encouraging jurisdictions to improve their legislation, improve their enforcement, and collaborate with each other more closely, it's more important than ever.
Now, you just mentioned a whole network of Iranian proxies and fellow travelers and other terrorist organizations that end up, even if they're not directly involved with Iran, end up as being part of this framework and benefiting financially. You mentioned ISIS in Africa, but there's also Al Qaeda, there's also Polisario, which is, was never particularly religious, but then all of a sudden started dealing with Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations. How do you see that working out? US has been largely absent from Africa, except for dealing with some conflict-related issues and counterterrorism operations in the West. What do you see happening as a result of this proliferation of groups?
Well, I would tell you, Irina, that we certainly were not absent from Africa during the Trump administration. I mentioned the Gulf. I spent a lot of time in the Gulf, but I also spent a great deal of time in sub-Saharan Africa, in particular, in Sudan, multiple trips to Sudan, multiple trips across the region, including to Somalia, Uganda, you name it. And a big part of that was focused on working with those governments to identify and neutralize specific terror financing nodes, as well as to identify and combat other illicit finance networks, such as particularly related to the gold trade, and also related to the role of the Wagner mercenary group, which is a proxy group that Vladimir Putin uses. And they have mining concessions all over Africa where they're generating hard currency for the Russians. So hopefully, but we didn't talk a lot about that. We kept it pretty quiet, frankly. Hopefully the Biden administration is continuing down that path and working with these countries. They should be if they're not.
And yet we are not seeing any reduction in those terrorist groups. Quite the contrary. In the past year, they've basically publicly announced their return to growing actively from dormancy or relative dormancy, and we are seeing that they are benefiting from these activities, and there doesn't seem to be any enforcement there either. Now, one question that I've had direct domestic repercussions for the U.S. That was the case of Turkey-Iran collaboration on money laundering involving gold and oil arrangements and banks. And for a while, there was a rather scandalous affair going on in the U.S. courts regarding all of that, and there was a major investigation. Whatever happened with that? Now Turkey is trying to play nice with everybody, but pretending to kick out RGC and prevent RGC operations, but other sources are saying that that's not really the case. What's happening with the money laundering aspect that was such a big deal for so many years?
Well, that court case that you're talking about, the Hulk Bank case, which is a case involving a Turkish state-owned bank that was deliberately trying to evade sanctions, in this case under the Obama administration, by transacting for the Iranians with the Iranians involving gold, because the Iranians want gold since the Iranian rial is not worth anything outside of Iran. And so that prosecution is still going forward, despite multiple efforts by the Turkish government to claim sovereign immunity and to not have that proceed. So that's a good thing. There, of course, are a lot of questions about Erdogan's direct involvement in that use of that bank. Certainly, we've had individuals who've been arrested who have turned state's evidence, claimed that he was directly personally involved. So that court case will play out. I will tell you that that my experience with the Turks on money laundering issues, with the Turkish government, I should say, was not a terribly positive one. In fact, ultimately, I wound up suspending the bilateral discussions that we were having on terrorist financing, and ultimately we removed the Treasury attaché that we had in Ankara because it really just was not a good use of time. The Turks will take action when they see fit, but they were at the time very unwilling to reciprocate and to share information with us about what they were doing. Southeastern Turkey, and actually huge parts of Turkey, are now home to many of the key ISIS financial facilitators, many of the Daesh facilitators that are still in operation. And you mentioned, of course, the growth in the Daesh cells across Africa. In part, this is because the Biden administration gave Afghanistan, which is a country the size of the state of Texas, gave it over to terrorists, to the Taliban, to the Haqqanis, who are directly affiliated with Al-Qaeda. And you see a massive resumption in opium and heroin production, the drug trade, illegal metals trade out of Afghanistan. It's a narco state. And the amount of money flowing into terrorist coffers as a result, which they then use and they send to their various affiliate organizations across the world, especially in Africa, but also in Southeast Asia, that money flow is now picking up. So we are, again, because of the disastrous handling of Afghanistan, we are going to see an uptick in terrorist violence, including terrorist violence directed at the United States.
Now, in your opinion, how would President Trump have handled the Afghanistan withdrawal to prevent that outcome? We've heard a lot about whether or not he should have engaged with them to begin with, but in theoretical, let's say he had won the second term and he had been in the position to make the decisions that Biden ultimately did. What would have been done differently in terms of preventing Taliban from turning it into another narco state?
Yeah, look, Irina, I don't have a crystal ball. I couldn't predict for you, but what I can tell you is that there's no way President Trump would have allowed such a chaotic, haphazardous, precipitous withdrawal. There's no way that he would have ignored the advice of the military, who wanted the additional troops necessary to prevent the immediate, instantaneous collapse. There's no way he would have given up Bagram Air Base, which Biden did, because he wouldn't allow the necessary number of troops, and they were limited in how many they could have. And so they had to make a Sophie's choice. They had to decide between Bagram or Kabul, and they chose Kabul. And as a result, Bagram was quickly overrun, and the Taliban released hundreds of terrorists, especially ISIS terrorists, who were imprisoned there. And then you had the suicide attack and the killing of the 13 service members. None of that would have happened. It would have been an orderly departure, and not one where you had this massive disintegration of the Afghan national forces. Because when the United States, when Joe Biden instructs his military to pull all of the logistics support, surprise, surprise, Afghan airplanes are not going to fly without that U.S. support, and you see the ensuing bloodshed that's happened.
Now, Afghanistan turning into a narco state that benefits Hezbollah and other Iranian proxies, and of course Iran itself, because one of the main criminal enterprises that finances Iran and shadow economy is of course drug trafficking. Now, I think it would be accurate to say that Iran is not just Iran. Iran is Iran plus its allies such as Assad, Syria, and Lebanon, that's held by Hezbollah, and various assorted proxies and entities who and the territories and influence they hold across Latin America, Africa, and so forth. So we are seeing this growing empire of Iran interests everywhere. These financial interests are becoming consolidated. Iran is increasing its influence. It has turned Houthis from partners into proxies. It's pursuing the same direction with Hamas. How do you see the integration of these economies coming together, given the passivity of the Biden administration on sanctions against them?
Well, the Iranians had a very deliberate strategy to try to create a land bridge, a geographic arc of control that stretched from Iran itself through Iraq into Syria and then down into Lebanon. And they continue to pursue that objective. We, together with the Israelis and others, and sometimes with the help of the Iraqi government, I think we're fairly effective at preventing that from happening, but they're still working at it. And as they regain access to the international financial system, and as they regain, huge balance of trade surpluses with these dollars and euros that are going to float back into the central bank of Iran, which is a terrorist sanctioned bank, because we know what they do. We had specific evidence on how the Central Bank of Iran, together with its governor, the central bank governor, were deliberately moving money around into the pockets of terrorist groups. And so now when you look, you will see a significantly emboldened Iran, a significantly enriched Iran, And you have terrorist groups that have also begun, you mentioned the Houthis becoming now a full proxy, but the Hezbollah is now collaborating in Yemen with Houthis. And the Iranian general who was responsible for arming the Houthis and Hezbollah with these drones and these missiles, he had started traveling before he had a heart attack and died. He had started traveling to Venezuela. So keep your eye not just on the Middle East, but keep your eye on what Iran and Hezbollah are up to in Venezuela as well.
Venezuela, from what I am hearing, is becoming a tremendously powerful force in Latin America, not only destabilizing force by way of refugee crisis and so forth, but also by way of infiltration through its partnership with Hezbollah-linked characters across other countries. That is in direct violation of the Monroe Doctrine and U.S. national security interests, and yet we're hearing almost nothing about that. How what is there a plan to deal with this growing network of terrorists, money launderers, drug traffickers, and unfortunately dictatorial characters that are arising right next door to us?
I don't see it. In fact, what we've seen in the past, just the past 2 weeks, was a secret trip that was made by the senior director on the National Security Council for Western Hemisphere, who flew down to Caracas to negotiate directly with Maduro's henchmen. And it's pretty clear to me that the Biden administration in the coming weeks is going to try to remove limitations on oil production in Venezuela. And we're going to careen from one crisis to the next.
Doesn't that also endanger our few remaining allies in Latin America?
Oh, of course it does, Irina. When you look at what Maduro and Chavez before him was doing with all the cash they had, they were deliberately trying to topple democratically elected governments around the region. And of course, the country that's vital to all of us at this stage is Colombia, which is heading into presidential elections. And there's no question that Maduro would like to see the FARC candidate, the FARC being the former terrorist group, narcotics traffickers, you name it. They're running a candidate to try to replace Ivan Duque, who is very pro-American. But we'll also see Venezuela when they begin to receive this economic windfall as sanctions are relaxed or removed. They will resume bankrolling the Nicaraguans. Ortega, who has been out conducting through his national police extrajudicial killings of journalists and politicians in Nicaragua. They'll resume bankrolling the Cuban regime. They will resume support to Argentina and to the Kirchnerists down there. So yes, I mean, these dictatorships are colluding with one another to work against democracies around the world. And so far, I don't see a coherent Biden administration strategy to fight it.
I don't see the US really actively working with Latin American countries towards any positive end on any issue as far as I see. So that should not be surprising. Now, I don't want to keep you too long. I have two last remaining questions. One is a little bit provocative. There are some who say that sanctions as a tool of foreign policy is outdated due to the collusion of major actors such as China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and various semi-lesser actors that work with them to very actively circumvent those sanctions and create their own financial systems, alternatives to SWIFT, and so forth. And not to mention China's digital currency that's supposed to play a role in all of this to try to displace the dollar on the market, which may take time but still might happen. And in general, kind of make it extremely difficult to enforce sanctions by virtue of cooperating and integrating with so many countries on so many issues that it becomes virtually impossible to enforce all of it. How do you view this position?
I view it as flat wrong,
Mhm.
completely wrong and not grounded in facts. The fact of the matter is that when we took over and began reimposing sanctions, I'll just take Iran as an example, because we knew that the Iranians still harbored their clandestine desire for nuclear weapons. And by the way, the Mossad proved it when they conducted that daring raid and grabbed the archives. When we say archives in English, people kind of tend to think of some dusty warehouse where stuff sits. This that's not what was happening here. This was a facility being maintained by the Iranians so that they had all of the necessary materials, the binders, the CD-ROMs, all of it was there with warhead design information, all of this that the Israelis, that Netanyahu, demonstrated to the United Nations and to the world. If you are a country that doesn't have nuclear weapons ambitions, why are you keeping all of this stuff in a readily available library right there in Tehran? But look, when we took over and we began imposing those sanctions, we took a country that was running a $6.1 billion trade surplus in 2019, and by 2020 they were running a $3.5 billion deficit. The rial, as I mentioned, cut its value in half, and we were having an enormous effect on the thinking of the regime. Qasem Soleimani, before he met his ultimate end, had been reduced to scraping around, trying to come up with money by hook or crook to funnel to Hassan Nasrallah and his Hezbollah proxies and so on. Nasrallah, before we started this, was getting at least 700 million a year from the Iranians. And by the end of our work, he was having to engage in telethons, literally telethons, soliciting donations, admitting, don't take my word for the effectiveness of sanctions, take Hassan Nasrallah's word, take the Ayatollah's word, who talked about the effectiveness of the Treasury in its war, in its economic war. So sanctions can be effective, but here's where I would agree with critics. Sanctions are not a substitute for a strategy. You have to have a strategy, you have to know what you're trying to achieve, and you have to understand how to employ sanctions along with other measures, including the credible threat of military force, as Soleimani found out. But when you do that together in a collaborative way with your strategy, you can have great effect.
I would certainly not argue with that. Now, for the last question, I will hope to end on a somewhat positive note. You previously mentioned that the Congress should be trying to push the administration into doing the right thing through statutes, through congressional efforts. What would you suggest? What would be the specific items that you think would be most constructive in this context?
Well, look, I think there's not going to be much that they can do with regard to this disastrous Iran deal in the near term, because the deck is stacked against them with the executive branch's prerogatives. But I think that everybody knows that deal has got a shelf life of about 2 years, and I don't foresee a lot of Western companies jumping in, even if a deal is struck. I do think the Chinese will continue to up their purchasing of oil, but as I've said, they're already kind of doing that. So there will be benefit to the Iranian economy, but as you've pointed out with this sanctions evasion scheme, they're already getting some of that benefit today. Where I do think Congress urgently needs to keep the pressure up is in connection with Russia. It was only after Nancy Pelosi broke ranks with Joe Biden on the continued purchasing of Russian oil by the United States, when she finally said, we need to stop this, that Biden did the right thing and announced that we were going to prohibit further imports of Russian oil and gas. And the more that they can do in the Russian context to pressure the Biden administration to levy upon Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin the very kinds of sanctions that we put on Iran and Venezuela, true full spectrum sanctions on the Russian economy. That I would think is the most important thing. and the most constructive thing that Congress can do right now.
I would hope that they will listen to your words, because otherwise the near future does not seem all that promising. But hopefully common sense will continue to prevail, as it increasingly seems to be setting in, even on Congress, even despite all the drama and polarization. That was most enlightening. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for shedding light on these issues that, I think, to average listeners seem to be very mysterious and hard to understand and complex, and they can be, but you made them very simple and accessible to all of us. Thank you again for joining us. That was Marshall Billingsley discussing the recent Wall Street Journal article about the Iran's money laundering networks and circumvention of sanctions. We will be continuing on exploring these topics in future episodes. Please stay tuned for our discussion next week. It will be at our normal time, 9 p.m. Tuesday. And with you was the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider, Irina Zuckerman. Thank you so much, and hope to see you all next week.